Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you all to the meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee. Can I remind everyone at the start to switch off all mobile phones and electronic devices because it does interfere with our sound system. So item 1 is PE 1423, Harnessing the Talent of Public Sector Staff. The first item on the agenda is our round table discussion on PE 1423 on harnessing the talent of public sector staff. And previously we agreed that we'd have a round table discussion, and this is the first in this session for the Public Petitions Committee. So can I first of all welcome all of you to our round table. You're all very welcome. Thanks very much for giving up your time to come along and speak to us today. Obviously we want to learn more about the petition about unreasonable learners and the current management practices in the public sector. Can I ask that you do put your contributions through me just so we can manage it. And we have around 45 minutes for today's session. And we have obviously a number of very experienced and very talented witnesses, so thank you very much for coming along today. I'd like just first of all just go round the tables and ask you if you just introduce yourself. I'm David Stewart, I'm the Labour MSP for the Highlands and Islands region.
Jim Brodie, SNP MSP for South of Scotland.
Jim Mather, I'm Chairman of Gale Limited in East Kilbride.
Tom McLaughlin from the Improvement Service.
Angus MacDonald, MSP, a member of the committee.
Richard Curley, Queen Margaret University.
Adam Ingram, MSP for Carrick, Cumberland and Doon Valley.
Gordon Hall of the Unreasonable Learners.
Jackson Carlo, MSP West of Scotland.
Dave Watson, I'm the Head of Bargaining Campaigns for Unison Scotland.
Janet Whitley, working on workforce development in Scottish Governments.
John Wilson, MSP, Central Scotland.
Nicola Richards, Organisational Development, Leadership and Learning, the Scottish Government.
And McTaggart, MSP in Glasgow.
Thank you all for your introductions. And just for the record, could I just ask that my membership of Unison is noted for the record, and obviously Dave Watson's the senior officer that I currently deal with, and I should also welcome back Jim Mather, who's a well-kent face from the Scottish Government in the past, and MSP, so you're very welcome, Jim, for coming along. Perhaps I could start by asking Gordon Hall just to run through very briefly some of the issues to do with the petition. I suppose the key point really for me is what you hope to achieve by your petition, Mr. Hall.
We're dealing with a very broad and complex issue, but what I'm trying to do is simplify it into one major issue in actual fact, and I've reflected it in the handout that I've given here, which is this one here, which is at the top one there. And really what we're saying is that what we're observing is there is great effort being put into by very good people into all kinds of projects all over the public sector and into the private sector. But what we need to move away from is actually the application of methods or new structures into actually be considering how we think, and not only how the individual thinks, but how the organisation thinks. Because if we do new structures and new methods from the existing thinking, then all we're doing is repeating the same problems that we've got. I mean, that's Albert Einstein's famous phrase, I don't know when he died in 1940, so it was pre-war. And of course, everybody's been saying the same thing ever since, that in actual fact, change happens at the thinking level, not the doing level. If you do from the same thinking, then in actual fact, very little changes. The Christie Commission, for example, identified large areas of things that we should be addressing. What it didn't do was address the thinking that created those problems and the thinking that was necessary in actual fact to move forward. So, as Jim keeps saying, the two have to go together, but I'm trying to create that balance by concentrating on how we think. The second overhead I have in front of you, in actual fact, is a recognition that we can't do it in bits and pieces. Because our experience over the past 20, 30 years is we've had excellent projects, but the whole hasn't learned from this project. And the status quo, in actual fact, with time, has come back and eroded the progress that is made. So somehow we need to be thinking of how we change the thinking, or how we enable the thinking of the whole, not just in individual projects.
Thank you very much for that. And My next question, so, is to bring Dr. Richards in from the Scottish Government, really to ask the Scottish Government, what is your view of this petition?
And the substance behind it is of great interest to the Scottish Government, and a lot of the theory and underpinning thinking, I think, has been very influential now within the Scottish Government. I suppose our difficulty in trying to work through what action, what thinking, what you would do on the back of this is harder. It's harder. I mean, we have a lot of work underway. I think it's very influential now when we think about some of the improvements, some of the more experimental approaches, which are now more and more embedded within the sort of way in which the NHS is thinking at a Scottish Government level, trying to bring that through within our own structures within Scottish Government. And my responsibilities are for civil servants, if you like, and the learning of civil servants. We've done a lot of work around systems thinking. That's very embedded now in the way in which our civil servants learn, the outcomes-based approach, encouraging people to work across the system and to engage others in the system in thinking about possible solutions. I chair a group of people brought from across the system on collaborative leadership, which is all about trying to bring through these kinds of ideas and concepts into our ways of working. So a huge amount of sympathy with the theory that underpins it. And I suppose the question is to try and take this at a whole society level. It's how do we do that? You know, how do we do that? Because I think we're trying across the piece to engage right across with partners in different systems and with communities to take this forward. But it's, you know, is there something that we're missing that we've not yet struck upon? But certainly a lot of the research underpinning is very familiar to us and is work that we've, you know, been taking forward for some time.
Thank you for that. And can perhaps bring Dave Watson at this stage. Mr. Watson, how do we change the way the public sector thinks and operates?
I suppose from a trade union perspective, we're probably more in the doing than the thinking category, I suspect. So I think Gordon would rightly pick us up there. But I do agree with the underlying approach. Gordon did mention the Christie Commission. I was an expert advisor to the Christie Commission, and I think though it may not be clear, the report was very focused on writing a relatively short report, so it didn't include a huge amount of background thinking there. But it did consider these issues, and it did underpin its recommendations. And it's not often quoted, I notice, including the briefing for today, but actually the Christie Commission did highlight systems thinking as a way forward for the public, and that wasn't an accident. Let me illustrate the point in a practical way with just one story. While we were doing the Christie Commission, we went to a large local authority, and around a round table we had Revs and Bens staff, essentially housing benefit, council tax, etc. And this local authority had essentially taken away most of the staff from the sharp end and put them into a shared service centre in the centre. And when I explained the systems thinking to this group of staff and I said, look, there's this guy called John Seddon, this is what he does, etc., etc. Does this ring any bells with you? And they said, oh, absolutely, Dave. The front office person said, well, we used to deal with 80% of inquiries when people came through the door. Now we deal with 20% of inquiries at the door, and we punt the other 80% off to a shared service centre. The staff from the shared service centre said, yeah, and the comment was, and most of the queries that we deal with are because someone hasn't got something they wanted, and we punt things around, things get lost. And so the 80% figure, which most of us would recognise from any call centre operation, you ring up a power company, a TV company, everything else, you all know that that's what happens. And yet we persist with this view that if we lump everything together into a big factory somewhere, that somehow this will be more effective and more efficient. So there's a very practical example of the fact that actually if we redesigned the work and worked out what was necessary to deal with the customer or the service user's demands first time, we would design very different public services from the current thinking that gets imposed by management consultants who come in and say, here's the Blue Peter approach, one I did earlier.
Right. Thank you very much for your contribution, Mr. Watson. Can I bring in Chick Brody?
Yes, good morning. Interesting paper. As I suppose a follower of Seddon's view about command and control, I'm sympathetic, but there are some questions that, even reading his book, Command and Control, some questions that were raised in my mind. First of all, are leaders born or are they made? And the paper quite rightly points out the fact that we need leaders to provide direction And the second thing is the management culture. It's not, I don't think it's just management culture. It's how do we change our society's culture to be more participative and less divisive. Having said that, we have an agenda at a national level, the National Performance Framework. I mean, how do we feed through, how do we encourage at all levels of public sector an encouragement to achieve national, and I won't use targets or goals, but national outcomes as we wish. And I think the last point I have is talking about the thinking, which I think is important. Having been involved in manufacturing for lots of years, and more latterly running up against continuous improvement processes and quality circles and systems like Lean and Six Sigma and Kenzan and what have you, I never see that mentioned. I've never come across it in the public sector as to what we're addressing and how we encourage the improvement of our processes from the bottom up.
Thanks for that. I'm looking for a victim to answer that question. I think Jim Mather looks a good subject too.
Well, yeah, I think leaders are tutored. We want to see more leaders that are mentoring and bringing people forward, etc. The societal changes, I think that's absolutely fundamental, that we have a strong society, people participating at all levels. National outcomes, maybe we change politics if we have enough statistical process control charts on the desks of government, and that they're monitoring everything from HIP operations to the level of unemployment and feeding that back into the process. And as far as from the manufacturing sector is concerned, Seddon's quite clear. He thinks that there's we should be more about method and thinking and less about tools. And I think what is the genius of Seddon is that he has taken systems thinking from manufacturing and applied it to the service sector, recognising that it's different. Services are about activities, they're intangible, they require trust, relationships, communications, etc. And what's different about services is the variation comes in the punter, in the case, whereas variation in manufacturing, you're trying to squeeze variation out of the subcomponents of the product. And he's saying we've got to handle that variation. That's why Dave correctly says that the back office shared service doesn't work. We need to try and nail things at the point of contact. And he's also saying don't look for savings in procurement, don't look for savings in scale. The savings are in flow, in end-to-end times, how quickly we get the job done. Last year I went down and spent a month in Lincoln looking at what Lincoln was doing on housing benefits, housing repairs, void lets, planning, building control, adult social care, watching the Vanguard method in action. And the one that was the best example was adult social care. It was taking them, before this event, 1,189 days to put a shower in an elderly person's ground floor of their house. They got it down to 25 days, big impact on the person, big impact on their family, but keeping them at home 4 years longer, not in residential home, not in nursing home, not in hospital. So there's a huge impact there. And I think the other thing I'd just like to put on the record, and that is my Seddon awareness came from a civil servant who slipped me the book, Freedom from Command and Control. And for that, I'm long-term grateful to Tom Tumilty.
Could I ask an aspect of leadership? The leadership in the new world, if I can say, is a systems designer. He's not your, decision maker and people who can inspire people. He's the one who actually designs the systems to enable people. I mean, where John Seddon and others are very successful is because they concentrate on designing the system with the people in mind, with the customer in mind. So they're thinking systems-wise, and they're thinking. They're respecting the people, highly respecting the people, and not wanting to control them, to enable them. So the leader is the systems designer. So, when I'm talking about leadership of this group, what I would hope is that we can design a system to answer Nicola's question as to how we involve the whole of society in thinking about how we move forward.
Thank you for that. Jackson Carlow, District Jackson.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, my background in business was that all discussions had to come to a practical conclusion. And I'm slightly struck by the comments Nicola made. And having immersed myself in the content of all of this, the expressions from my childhood, trying to catch a bar of soap in a bath and playing tig with a fox, kind of came to mind. And this is a petitions committee, and this petition has to come to something practical that we then do. And I think we can all identify examples. We can all sympathise and understand the underlying concern and recognise it from our own experience. But what do you believe this petitions committee should ultimately seek to do as a next practical step?
I think the next practical step is to facilitate, maybe the second step is to facilitate a dialogue across the whole of our society. You know, there are a lot of people who are already thinking systems thinking and all this within our society, and if we can connect them together to be a critical mass, then we're going to start moving forward. You know, I'm trying to argue again what I said earlier. Doing it in bits and pieces hasn't been working over the past 2 years. So you're right in saying it's a bit like a bar of soap. But that's basically what we're trying to get to. And I feel that the first stage in you leading this is actually to look at how the public sector thinks, how the organisation thinks. If we can do a study into how the organisation thinks, then you're on a basis by which you can move it out into the whole of society. Because it is actually happening in the whole of society. It's starting, you know, we're starting to realise that the old ways, in actual fact, are not producing the well-being and the effectiveness of our society. So there is beginning to be a discontent within society. So if we can accelerate that, such that we're talking to the whole of society and facilitating dialogue is the technical term for it.
Okay, John Wilson.
The issue for me is, and the mention has been made of the Christie Commission and what we can take out of the Christie Commission, but unfortunately what we still see at the present time, particularly in times of cutbacks in local government and central government, there seems to be the silo thinking becomes more entrenched, and instead of doing frontline and delivering frontline services, we seem to see the management structures close in on themselves and take away frontline services. And I think both Dave Watson and Jim Mather gave good examples of where if you deliver the right frontline services, you actually, it's preventative spending and you save money. What do particularly Dave Watson and Gordon Hall think we can actually learn from the Christie Commission, and how do we see these practical solutions being implemented at local government level? And that might be a question for the improvement service as well, and because it is about delivery of services, and it's about frontline services, and it's trying to get that thinking back into the process that preventative spending, savings can be made at the front line. It's not about shutting down the frontline services.
Bring in Dr McLaughlin for this, and then I'll bring in Dave Watson.
I think my sort of view is that the Christie Commission has set up a different kind of conversation among the public services more widely, and I think my sort of experience would be that the silos actually are starting to kind of break down more, because I think once we actually start to talk about outcomes, that takes us away from this is our service provision, this is yours, this is, you know, into something about how do we actually work collaboratively. And I think certainly with the kind of statement of ambition around the community planning partnerships, etc., there is a kind of thrust that, you know, there is an expectation actually even more so that the public sector will work collaboratively to actually achieve outcomes with communities, not in terms of doing things to communities, and again Christie was very strong on that. So I think my sense would be that in fact there is a greater appetite and a greater willingness actually to work together collaboratively to achieve outcomes. I think there's an acceptance that that's the way that we have to work, that we don't actually all individually, you know, one organisation doesn't have an answer.
Thank you for that. Dave Watson.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are bits, and this is why I think Gordon's probably right about the lack of underlying thinking. You see a range, obviously I read a whole range of reports about change in the public sector, and there are bits of Christian, bits of system that come out of that. However, there's still a very strong belief in what Chip was talking about, heroic leadership models. You know, time and time again, you know, I read Scottish Government and other reports, and essentially it's all about leadership, and there's this notion that Richard Branson type figures that are going to come rushing and save us. And they're not. And it's the wrong model. And the reason it's the wrong model is because Jim made the point that it's different from manufacturing, is that most public services are delivered by people. So actually what you need are enabling management styles and do that people stuff. And frankly, there are report after report comes out and proposal after proposal, whether it's adult care or any of the other big changes around. And what you'll find is the workforce will be about 3 little paragraphs in a 60, 70-page report. And it's just simply just not there. You know, it's as if we've got this great thing, we're going to merge these people, we're going to move things around, and then, oh, there are these people that are going to do this at the end of the day. Let's stick a few paragraphs in the end about the people. It seems to me, if you want a practical way forward on that basis, that what we need is, you know, essentially you've got to free people in that, but government can help by having a broad framework approach to particularly some of the people issues, because, you know, someone used the phrase earlier about, you know, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Actually, if you create a framework where people are you know, able to innovate, you know, and health services is a very good example of this. There's been lots of big changes made in the design of health services because there's a framework that allows staff essentially to say, you know, this is a better way of doing it, knowing they're not going to get made redundant next week as a result of coming up with that innovation. And so if you create a staffing framework that deals with these issues, then you create the atmosphere and the environment whereby staff can innovate.
Mr. Hall?
You know, I'm very complimentary of the work that has been done and the initiatives that's been done, but at the same time we need to be looking at the barriers that in actual fact are stopping it. You know, if we do have a command and control culture, then that creates a massive barrier to all of the work that you're talking about, Dave, and the rest of us. So at the same time as all of this effort, we need to be thinking about what is stopping us, in actual fact, moving forward.
Adam Ingram?
Yeah, just picking up on those points, I think clearly it's leadership at the front line that matters. It's not strategic leadership. It's actually people who are delivering services actually engaging with each other is the critical factor. If I can come back to what Nicola suggested was the main problem, is how you actually change a whole society's culture and thinking. And I wondered if there were any examples of this in other parts of the world, and what mechanisms are available to us to actually initiate culture change. And to what extent does the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government can assume some sort of responsibility for this? Clearly, other reading I've been doing recently is revisiting the spirit level and the importance of reducing inequalities and ensuring that everyone's got a stake in our society. Could I have some thoughts on that? I mean, it's pretty wide-ranging, but
could I bring in Richard Curley first and then Janet Whitley? Yeah. Richard?
Thanks very much for that. I have a number of observations which don't really answer your question, but I'll come round to that in a way. I've been bedeviled for a long period of time now by various observations, both when I worked in public services, as I still do, and since I became an academic. One of them was the manifest experience of seeing some very good islands of practice in virtually every public service organisation I come into contact with, but I emphasise the word islands of practice, because often they are either floating in a sea of indifferent mediocrity is harsh, but indifferent practice. And there is often considerable resistance to both scalability and dissemination across the entire system. And Jim Mather gave an example, which one can find in a number of public organizations, of saying, here is an organization that achieves X, whether it's the completion of an appendectomy or the installation of a shower or an assessment for special educational support within 3 weeks, and does it well, and the outcome is good over a 5-year period. Why aren't the rest of you learning from that? I think there are 2 or 3 reasons. One is that there is a considerable degree of what I would call non-competitive competition as between public bodies. You simply have to go in, and any of you, well, who are MSPs around this table, go and talk to people in one of the local authorities within the area that you represent, and just ask them in passing, in chatting, what do they think of South Ayrshire or East Ayrshire? And you're, oh, no, you know, we can't learn anything from them. And that's very hard to break down. I think it needs to be challenged. The second factor is that we often, I think, confuse those areas of public service activity, which are actually far more heterogeneous than we think they are. We talk about public services as though they're all the same. There is a place for command and control. There is a place for mass procurement. If I were running a local authority and I wanted to acquire 5,000 water glasses, I would expect the variation and tolerance on those to be Six Sigma. I would, and I would go to the cheapest provider of that glass, as this Parliament did, and probably got them from, I don't know, the Czech Republic or People's Republic or wherever. It's the variation factor that one has to build in, and that requires a lot more reflection than action. This is where I sympathise with Gordon's report and agree with it, that we are focused on doing, and with respect, Jackson Carlaw, sometimes one has to say, actually there is no immediate conclusion yet. We need to throw a stone in the water and come to an absolute outcome. I could come to some sub-outcomes for this committee.
Not really the purpose of this committee, though.
I understand that, and that's one of my presenting queries when I first spoke to a committee clerk, which was, what are we trying to achieve here? You are the water into which this petition has thrown a stone, and you will, I hope, talk to other MSPs about this and reflect on that when you have legislation or proposals in front of you.
Perhaps just to give you one example from another petition that we're dealing with, an initiative that I've been very keen on is the provision of insulin pumps throughout Scotland. There's a very clear laid-down Scottish Government policy, but why is there massive variation from one health board to another? And it is a cliche, but I can't think of a better expression of the postcode lottery. The unfortunate fact that if you require an insulin pump and you live in one part of the border, you get it. If you cross the border, you don't get it. Now, that is, at one level, naively, totally unfair. And irrespective of who is in power, I think it's very frustrating for the Health Secretary to find that the health boards are not doing what they're required to do. This committee is investigating this, and I wouldn't say more than that, apart from that we are visiting Western Isles very soon to have a more detailed discussion about it. But it is very frustrating. Petitioners come before us say, we cannot understand why there's a laid-down Scottish Government policy, but we don't get this where we live. So that's one of the frustrations we have to deal with, as a committee. Perhaps I could bring in Janet Whitley.
I thought it might be helpful to bring the attention of the committee to some of the work that the Scottish Leaders Forum's been taking forward on these sorts of workforce issues. Like others, I have a lot of sympathy with the points in Gordon's report, and I'm not suggesting that this work is a panacea to resolve all of the issues. But the Scottish Leaders Forum, which is a grouping that brings together about 300 different chief execs right across public service, is a grouping that's had a lot of interest in workforce development issues. And in recent times, there's been a workforce development group that started to take forward some very specific strands of work to address the issues coming out of the Christie Commission report and to address the sorts of issues about culture, attitudes, behaviours that we've been talking about so far in the context of public service. And there's some specific work streams that are now moving forward with deliverables and outcomes that have involved quite a lot of consultation, quite a lot of involvement right across different public service organisations. So it's just to signal that there's some steps and some practical action beyond those that others have mentioned through that route, which is very much cross-public service, to start to try and address specifically the culture change that I think is part of the petition before us.
Actually, could I, perhaps, I'm conscious of Jackson Carl's point earlier on about focusing on what we can do as a committee. If you focus on the petition, and I would just quote, it said, it urges the Scottish Government to review the considerable research into thinking that underpins the approach to managing the contribution of staff that have been taken in the past decades. I mean, has the Scottish Government got a view on that very specific aspect? Because that is something that we're keen to get a view from the Scottish Government. I don't know if Dr Richards would like to add something at this stage.
Yes. I mean, I would say that we have reviewed the research and, you know, actually through some of the initiatives that Jim Mather and others put in place during their time and right across the organisation, an interest in systems thinking. So I don't really see a huge amount of additional value in reviewing the research again, because I think actually, you know, we draw on Jake Chapman, we draw on systems thinking. A lot of this is used within the organisation to underpin things right now. So if I was thinking about how we would apply resources, then I would struggle, you know, to see that as a really valuable next step.
Well, that really is the key for us, and I'll bring in Jim Mather and then John Wilson.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed, Convener. I really wanted just to take the point of culture change that Jake Brody raised and Janet Whitley raised. And the observation coming from the practitioners we deal with when I'm working with Strathclyde is quite interesting, and that is a disbelief in culture change, that culture change is just too hard, you can't make it happen on its own. But what you can do is have a new purpose that drives culture. An example would be going to a planning department and saying, your purpose is to approve good projects, corollary, disapprove bad projects, and then getting in to measure the end-to-end time it takes to come to a decision. And measuring it starts the process where you also maybe cut down the number of jobs that a planner has open at any one point in time. You maybe put a front end on to handle the interrupt calls that come in. You might have a greater clarity on the applications, so there's fewer mistakes, fewer referrals, and you might get planners doing a lot less multitasking, because whilst women are better at multitasking than men, multitasking doesn't work. You know, it just is too much overhead. So once you've got the purpose, you can drive a cultural change and you can get ownership of it. And there's a woman I'm very keen on, Nancy Klein. Nancy Klein says, people only think when they talk, and people prefer to think than to obey. So talking to planners about purpose and getting them talking can get them having a sense of ownership of it and taking it on to the point that it actually is implemented.
Thank you for that, Jim. Could people keep the contributions reasonably short? Bring in Chick Brodie, followed by Gordon Hall.
Right. Just for clarity, the systems I mentioned in the context of manufacturing. The point I'm making is that they don't just apply there. Oh, and the key element of that is to generate participation. I sort of demur from system designer. So the key thing is, how do we, in particular with things like the Community Empowerment Bill and Procurement Bill, how do we encourage participation in the formulation of processes and policies going forward? And that's why I asked the question about leadership, because the leaders have to understand that and accept it.
John Wilson?
Yeah, I live in a local authority area which actually has a sub-banner service and people. And the concerns I have, the comments that have been made by Janet, is that the 300 leaders in the Leaders Forum that are made up of chief executives from local authorities and public bodies across Scotland. What Richard Kerley made reference to earlier is the islands of good practice, of good delivery. And it's how do we get down to making sure, as a local government, as central government, that we actually get that good practice instilled. Now, that comes through systems designs at a local level. And if you go back to Deming and what Deming did in Japan with the manufacturing industry after the war, actually showed that if you give the right tools to the right people at the front line, they will deliver, and they deliver well. And it's about making sure that those lessons of how that's delivered are then replicated and made use of. And unfortunately, I think when you have a top-down approach, you end up still thinking in your silo. You think about command and control rather than actually innovation and development taking place from the ground up. And it's just be interesting to find out whether or not, in terms of the government's thinking, that the Leaders Forum does get to the root of delivery, how services are being delivered at a local level, not how chief executives or senior managers think how it's being delivered, how it's being delivered by people on the ground. Go back to Jim Mather's example of over 1,000 days for a shower to be fitted, down to 25 days. And every time, as elected members, we make an approach to a local authority on behalf of a constituent, we keep on getting told, no, that can't be done. Yet if you speak to somebody in the local office, they say, oh, well, we could do that. But the problem is the management tell us we can't do that. And it's a can do rather than a can't do culture that we need to get into. So it'd be interesting to find out how the government are actually reflecting what's happening in the good practice on the ground.
Would either of our guests from the Scottish Government wish to make a brief comment? I'm a little bit tight for time, so if
yes,
you
I can make a very quick start then. Yes, and I think the mention of the Scottish Leaders Forum and the Chief Exec is very much about the commitment, but the participation in the work is from staff at all different levels, from different sorts of organisations, and I think that's central and key to the success of what comes out of the workforce development activities. And one example of a work stream is on community asset-based workforce development, which is a very specific strand of work to involve communities in the design of what the workforce development interventions need to be for the people delivering service. So not only is it staff, all different levels of the workforce, but also making sure there's an absolutely clear commitment to involve communities more widely in what the workforce development needs are.
Thank you for that. Can I just, Mr. Hall, can I just bring some of the other committee members who haven't spoken yet, and I'll maybe bring you in at the end. I can start with Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. A note from the papers that Mr. Hall's provided us with prior to the committee meeting that he's given us some good examples, such as comparing the proposal to the interdependence of a motor vehicle. He's also given us a wealth of references, such as John Seddon and Tom Johnson, which hopefully we'll be getting hold of pretty soon. He also makes reference to the Finnish education system in the paper, which significantly outperforms the UK and the USA, and indeed our education secretary has been over to Finland to investigate that particular success story. However, while he's given the committee a number of examples, and good examples, he hasn't actually provided us with an example of a country where the change from command and control has happened, or where the concept is being actually implemented or embraced, which we could point the Scottish Government towards. And I was wondering if Mr. Hall could perhaps pick that point up.
Okay, Mr. Hall, or if another colleague wants to come in, please let me know. Mr. Hall?
I don't think any other country has taken on this just quite such a big challenge, but this is Scotland, we can do it kind of idea. But can I go back to what John was saying there, in that there are loads of islands of very good practice, and the problem is that we haven't been learning from them. We've actually been doing these good practices for the past 20 or 30 years, and we're not learning from them. That's the big challenge that we have in front of us. Not that there's a shortage of effort, shortage of good people, but we don't learn from these good practices. And I was wondering if we could actually develop what Nicola was saying. I wonder if it's possible for the guests to get together and actually come back to the petition committee with a proposal of how we actually address the whole. Because it's the whole that in actual fact that needs to be addressed if we're going to get round this problem of islands of good practice and not learning from those islands of good practice. So is it possible that we can do that? Is that an outcome that you'd be happy with?
Perhaps that's something you can speak off stage about, but certainly from my point, I think that would be a very good idea. And I was going to ask actually Richard Curley about that. You mentioned the islands of good practice, and the definition is that there's an awful lot of bad practice throughout Scotland and the rest of the UK. In your experience, is it sometimes difficult for the best practice to be translated from one local authority or one health board to another? I mean, is that the issue? Which you know what the good practice is. Why can't we ensure everyone raises the game?
I would observe it's more, the phenomenon is more pervasive than that. It's not simply between local authorities and or health boards and other organisations. It can often be both within those organisations as an overall unit and indeed within individual units. I have observed only as a participant, but I've also spoken, for example, to a number of doctors about the extent to which both nursing and other support staff and doctors would observe different practices within different wards and clinical divisions of the same hospital. And will comment quite freely about the fact that in X unit they find that staff are encouraged and motivated and there's an open discussion. In another unit there is a culture of not challenging, of not arguing, of not discussing with what is laid down. Similarly in different local authorities. You did ask about how we extend and develop this more, I have a couple of, well, one, I think, fairly simple suggestion, which is that I'm always struck whenever I go to the COSLA local government awards ceremonies. They're a bit glitzy, and it's Jackie Bird or one of the other ones doing it. I hope she gets better, by the way. And there's an element there of people drinking too much and being self-congratulatory. But those events do tend to throw up observation about unit-level practice led by a bunch of men and women in Cumnock or Dalmellington or wherever. And I look at it and I think, that's good. Why is that not shared more widely? Why is that? And that's where I would come to a slightly different consideration of leadership, which is on occasion, I think there needs to be a shared leadership, whether from the leading people in local government through their organisations or through this Parliament or through ministers, to say, actually, we want to draw this to the attention of a wider body of people. We want to push it more than just one night, tomorrow in the paper, and then we go on. It's, what are you doing about it? And final remark is that I sometimes think that one has to, if one looks for leadership, on occasion there needs to be collaborative leadership, drawing people out, encouraging people. On occasion, leadership just involves kicking some people. And you can do both. And it doesn't have to contrast the bully with the... and all the lessons of leadership that I see from the research that Gordon refers to going back a good while talk about variation, about contingency in leadership. Sometimes people need to be told, here's something good happening. What's your reaction to it? Don't just poo-poo it and look the other way.
I think it's a very interesting point. Can I bring in Dave Watson?
I think there is a case, and certainly when we did Christie, there were lots of good examples that we produced. Obviously, there's always the argument, well, that works in X, will it work in Y? But I think the underlying ideas are there. The difficulty is, frankly, in terms of the heroic leadership model that, frankly, is still the pervasive view, is that the emperor's clothes applies as well. As essentially, oh, yes, fine, we'll do that. And that's riddled through public service, as it is in the private sector as well. And my difficulty is that I attend many discussions with very senior managers in the public sector about particular projects, and you say to them, look, modern thinking, systems thinking, and systems thinking is a very good example. You say, have you really thought about systems thinking for this approach rather than this management consultant who's given you one that they produced 20 other places? And they say, I think system thinking is a great thing, Dave. We must do more of it, etc. But you're not doing it here, aren't we? And the point I'm getting at is that just don't get it. There are large numbers of very senior leaders in public and private sector, because I was negotiating some of these shambles in the private sector 15 years ago, which they all wish they hadn't done now. But the reality is that they just don't get it, and that's why I do think Gordon has a point about the underlying thinking. If you could change and get an understanding of that, then at least we'd be on the first page of a solution.
I'm at the point, I'm afraid I have to wind this up, but I was going to say at the very start that we need to be very clear about what the petition is calling upon, and I think I mentioned that to the Scottish Government colleagues. But I think Gordon Hall's actually suggested a way forward, and his suggestion is that the guests that we have today will meet elsewhere, come back with us with a paper that we can look at in a bit more detail. And I think that's a very good idea, and I'm hoping all our guests will agree on that, and certainly Jim Mathers is agreeing to it. And I think that would be very, very useful to us. I'm sure all the committee members agree this is a very, very interesting area, one there's a lot more work we need to do on this. And I certainly would be keen that certainly the clerks go away, analyse all the comments made during this debate at the official record and come back with suggestions for us to take forward. Clearly the Scottish Government's key, and I'm sure they've looked at the issue about research, and we've had some feedback from Dr Richards on that. Would any of my colleagues would like to comment?
Just on that, I agree with that. Part of your consideration might be looking at, do we do a pilot of good, looking for islands of good practice? Is there somewhere, or a council, that has the competitive position, where you might create, looking at creating that as a pilot, where the good practices can be put together and see how it actually works. And if that's effective, then translation to other areas, I think, would be quite simple.
Thank you for that. Jackson Carroll?
I won't oppose the suggestion, Convener, but I'm clearly distinctly lukewarm about it. I actually think the petition should be closed. I think the Scottish Government have told us that they have considered all of this, and I think there is a danger in us trying to translate a sentiment into, ironically, an institutionalised approach to trying to give effect to a solution which is the antithesis of what this is meant to be, and that is my reservation.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Hurls. I think you made it clear at the start your views on that as well. But nevertheless, I think if we do have a paper for as soon as possible, one of our future meetings, to look at various options open to us, obviously that will be one of the options. But I think this has been a very, very good discussion today. I think it's very stimulating, and it's excellent that we're talking about improvement in the public and indeed the private sector. So can I conclude by thanking all of our guests who've turned up today. I think it's been a very, very good round table. It's the first one that we've done. Thank you all for coming along, but we do look forward to hearing from you again, and I'm sure that Gordon Hall will coordinate a response back to us with all the other guests here, and I'll suspend for 5 minutes to allow our guests to go. Thank you again for your attendance. Could we reconvene the Public Petitions Committee? We're moving to item 2, consideration of new petitions. There are 2 new petitions for consideration today. The first new petition is PE 1438 by Lindsay Patty on improving services for people with mental illness. Members are note by the clerk and Spice briefing and the petition. Could I welcome the witness? Thank you very much for coming along today. If you could perhaps make a short presentation of around 5 minutes, I'll kick off with a few questions, then my colleagues will ask some additional questions. So thank you very much for coming along.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me here today in order to give evidence on my petition. Mental health is an extremely important issue that is gradually coming into the public light. 1 in 4 people will suffer from a mental health problem at some time in their life, which means that it's likely that everyone is affected, whether personally or through family or friends. I wrote this petition because unfortunately I am one of those 1 in 4. As someone who has a mental health problem, I feel that the stigma of having a mental health issue is extremely high and that there aren't enough services of a high standard available. I would like to emphasise that most care is given now in the community. However, I feel that the waiting time to see a mental health professional is too long. I understand that the Scottish Government is going to cut this to 18 weeks, but I feel this is still too long to wait. 2 people die from suicide every day in Scotland. I feel that if more people were seen quicker by a mental health professional, then this statistic would be lower. While care in the community is encouraged, sometimes hospital is needed for people who have mental health problems. From my experience and from experiences of others I have talked to, hospital is not the best place to get better. There are a lack of activities for patients to do. If there are activities, these mostly are not suitable for everyone. A wider variety of activities would keep patients stimulated and would take their minds off of their illness, even for a short period of time. No exercise group was provided, which is essential, as medication and lack of exercise can cause dramatic weight gain. Exercise is also proven to help your mental health. My 2 biggest concerns about hospital are firstly that under 18s are permitted to adult wards. People under 18 are naturally more vulnerable due to their age, but add a mental health problem to this and they are even more vulnerable. Most child and adolescent wards would be beneficial. I also feel a waiting time of 26 weeks for a child and adolescent mental health professional is too long, as finding a mental health problem quickly can sometimes mean it can be treated fully. My biggest concern about hospital is that the nurses sometimes have no time to help patients. This is especially true at night when the shifts are being changed over. A patient is more likely to be given a drug rather than be talked to. Usually Valium is given to sedate the patient without the problem ever being solved. The luckiest patients in hospital are the ones who have a family. Unless you know where to find information on things such as benefits and services, then you are left to fend for yourself. When leaving hospital, I think that patients should be given support in getting back into the world. Many patients end up back in hospital because they cannot cope with being home. If ready, help should be given in getting back to work. There are groups that do this already, but again, they are not widely known or advertised. More groups like this specifically designed for mental health would greatly benefit the mentally ill, as disability living allowance is being cut for many mental health sufferers. Support from their mental health team should also be given. The team should regularly visit and encourage the person, as it can be so hard to adjust to being home again. Finally, and most importantly, I feel that the stigma of mental ill health needs to be addressed. From a young age, children are taught social education, starting from relationships in primary school through to drugs and alcohol in secondary school. I feel that mental health should feature more heavily with the correct facts given. It is amazing and also saddening that so many people have the wrong facts about mental health. An example of this is people thinking that schizophrenics have split personality or that they are violent. By making information more easily available, these misconceptions wouldn't happen. In my opinion, the media is hugely to blame. Use of the word psycho are in newspapers daily for small reasons, like a footballer giving a bad tackle. Just yesterday I heard a news reporter calling a news story bonkers and someone being called a loony for having a different opinion from someone. When there's a murder, people automatically assume that the person is mentally ill, the most recent being Anders Breivik, who was not mentally ill. Why not focus on people like Florence Nightingale, who had bipolar disorder, or Gandhi, who had depression and anxiety? Mental illness doesn't have to be portrayed as a negative personality trait. With the right help, even the most ill people can do the most amazing things. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. We're just, in terms of examples of figures, I would throw Winston Churchill in as well, who suffered from depression. But you've predicted, I think, my first question, which was about stigma. And remember, in the 1980s, the Scottish Health Education Department had a poster which always struck me, and it said 6 months after Mary had a nervous breakdown, her friends are still recovering, which was, I think, was a very neat way of looking at stigma by association as well. Can you say a little bit more about stigma and your experience and what your petition hopes to achieve for that?
Well, I know that people that I've talked to have difficulty finding work if they do disclose their mental illness, because employers might think that they're unreliable. But in my opinion, I don't think people with mental health problems are any less or more reliable than anyone else, because anything could happen to anyone at any time.
And the second question before I bring my colleagues, I was speaking to some armed forces personnel recently, and they were saying there was quite a link with personnel, particularly who'd been at the front line and then were discharged, they left the army or the navy or the RAF and were in the community, that there was real concerns that they weren't really being picked up because of maybe acute anxiety they had, obviously, in the front line. Is that something you've had any experience of in terms of any of your colleagues or friends?
I work with SAMH Voluntary, and they have just had a scheme, they've just started a scheme with Poppy Scotland, who are helping troops who've just come back from the front line to get back into work and to help their mental health. So that's something I'll probably be involved in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Can I bring in John Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. I should declare at this point, I was up until recently the convener of the cross-party group in mental health and currently the deputy convener of that group. Could I ask Lindsay about the issue about the curriculum for excellence? Now, you've mentioned that there's a range of educational opportunities for children when they're at school. Do you think that there is not enough awareness of mental health issues in the education system? And if there was more awareness, then people would not only be able to recognise the symptoms, but also look for support and assistance and develop their own solutions to what they may see as episodes of mental health, not only for themselves but for their friends as well.
I wouldn't say there is enough about mental health. In my experience at school, we got taught about depression and stress during exams, but we didn't get taught that it was okay to have a mental illness. I fortunately did have a teacher who did have depression, and he talked to me about it, and the class, but that was just our class, that wasn't in the curriculum. I do think there needs to be more about a wide variety of mental illnesses. I've got the feeling that more serious, like psychotic illnesses, aren't talked about because it can be seen as scary. Nowadays there is quite a lot of mental health first aid courses. There's also a mental health hire at my local college that quite a few people, including some of my friends from school, are doing, which I think is really good, because it can, even if you don't know what to do later on, if you see something at the start, you can help and you'd know what was happening rather than being scared about it.
Carlo?
Lindsay, do you think the term mental health itself is just too broad a term to be more easily misunderstood? I mean, in my lifetime, a number of conditions, the vocabulary attached to them has changed, and public perception has changed with that change in vocabulary. But the term mental health encompasses such a huge range of conditions that it is much easier for ordinary members of the public to misunderstand or to be intimidated, or for whatever reason to be unhelpful. Is there a need to try and crystallise a new vocabulary in the public domain which would help to change public perception? Because I worry slightly that for as long as the term mental health is used and can be said and spoken in so many different ways, it will always be there to be misunderstood.
I think you would need to keep the term mental health because it is an illness of the mind as such. You can also have different labels, but I myself do not like labelling, like calling someone depressive or a schizophrenic. It's almost as if you're defining them by their illness. And personally, I am not my illness. I know this is just part of me. So I wouldn't want someone to call me the illness that I have. But I do understand why some people would have like anxiety if someone said they were mentally ill, because it is such a broad range. But I think mental health does need to be kept that, because that's what it is. It is an illness of the mind.
Okay, Angus MacDonald.
Good morning, Lindsay. I noticed in the papers that we have that you're a volunteer with the Scottish Association of Mental Health, and you have to be commended for that. I've been happy to support the See Me campaign, as I'm sure all my colleagues have, which deals with the stigma of mental health. There's also the Choose Life campaign, which is the Scottish Government-funded NHS initiative to address suicide and self-harm. Now, one of the key government strategies is to encourage more peer-to-peer work with support from trained staff who have recovered from mental health illness themselves. Would you see that as a way forward, and if we could encourage more of that?
Definitely, I think that would be a great thing. I know in my local area it is starting to happen in some SAMH places in North Lanarkshire, and I've not heard of its success yet because it's just started, but I think it's a great idea.
Okay, thank you.
Domingo?
Yes, thanks very much, Lindsay, for bringing this to our attention. The Mental Health Care and Treatment Act back in early 2000s was an attempt to try and shift the focus away from institutional care for people to community treatment and care. You seem to be quite critical of hospital treatment. Could you maybe expound a little bit more on that particular issue about treatment within hospitals? And are there particular issues that you think need to be addressed in terms of treatment within the community? Are there obstacles to people being their needs addressed in the community?
Well, due to nursing cuts as well as nurses not having enough time, there's a lot of paperwork that comes with mental health. You have to do a diary every day, the nurses, of each patient, and if there's 25 patients in a ward, that can take a long time to do, which is understandable. But in my opinion, if you need to be in hospital, you're very ill. I think more talking needs to be done in hospital rather than using medication in order to just sedate the patient, and rather than actually talking and working out the problem. And I think this is more a time issue rather than the nurses not caring.
Is that your experience, Lindsay, or is it people you've been working with?
It's my experience. It's my experience and people I've talked to as well.
Right. Okay. So you're looking for more talking therapies within hospital, or is it a case of you feel that people are being referred to hospital are the right people to be referred to hospital? They've got a significant, severe illness that needs to be treated urgently rather than treated over time in the community. You think that's okay, but it's actually what happens in the hospital that concerns you most of all?
Yeah, what happens in hospital does, and people end up in hospital a lot longer than they need to be because they're not being talked to, and sometimes people are just in to have their medication changed but can be in for months, and people can become institutionalised. Yes. Like in my experience, at 10 o'clock, I want a cup of tea because I got tea at 10 o'clock in the hospital, or like just be things like that. And that might not seem a big deal, but that's like a thing that's impacted in my life because I need to drink tea at 10. You know what I mean? Like just wee things like that can change a person.
Could I follow?
Sure.
The other specific criticism you mentioned in your remarks was the lack of particular provision for children and adolescents, and the fact that young people are having to go into adult wards. Was that your experience, Lindsay? And my understanding was that there's been a significant move towards establishing separate wards for young people.
When I was in hospital, I was 17, in an adult ward. The person closest to me in age was 2 years older than me, but had been in for a long time. And I think I did get good care. I got the same care as everyone else, but obviously I had different needs from adults. I was a teenager. I was going through puberty. I had different hormones as well as being ill. So I think there needs to be more wards just for children and adolescents, so that there's specialists that can deal with the hormones of normal teenagers.
And it'd be quite scary, I would imagine, being in a...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. John Wilson, then Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Convener. It's just really I should have said earlier, I do welcome this petition, and the comments that you've made in supplementary information to the petition. You make referral to the 18-week referral a patient may receive to go and see a consultant or a specialist. The issue for me is, do you think the doctors, the general practitioners, have enough knowledge and experience of dealing with mental health to make that referral? Because it's only when the individual is referred then the 18-week timetable may kick in. But my understanding and some of the experiences that have been relayed to me is that sometimes the general practitioner in the surgery isn't fully aware of the issues that they're trying to deal with, or the issues that the individual's trying to deal with, and therefore don't make the correct assessment, or, as you said earlier, prescribe drugs rather than referring someone on. So do you think there is enough knowledge within the general practitioners in dealing with mental health issues at a surgery level?
No, I think that general practitioners need more knowledge on mental health issues. They mostly deal with physical issues, and sometimes it can be very hard to diagnose. Like, they don't diagnose, but even just to notice that someone is mentally ill or is having a breakdown or some sort of mental health issue. I think if GPs had more knowledge, then a lot more people could be saved as well.
Thank you.
McTaggart.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Lindsay, for bringing this to our attention today at the Public Petitions Committee. Some of the 18 weeks, I do have some prior knowledge in the field, especially when you mention younger children being admitted to adult wards. I had worked in social work for a while before coming here. So it's still quite scary that that still goes on. But what really still frightens me is the lack of community support that there still is. And you mentioned earlier about the nursing support within the NHS. And we hear what you're saying about the nursing staff being so low that they aren't there to talk to you, even they would be there to medicate. But I also think that happens within the local authority as well. I think it's a really difficult process for not just the person who has the illness, but for their families to come to terms with that and to enable them to try and be comforted, supported and guided through how they deal with their family member. I'm just really quite worried that it's still 18 weeks to me is way far too long for anybody to be waiting. And I think, you know, that if we were able to tackle that load sooner, other areas in local government like social work and police and, you know, all those areas then wouldn't have to necessarily go into red alert and be called upon if it was dealt with sooner. I think, Convener, that it would be important for us to seek further information from some of the agencies that we've discussed today to take this petition further. I'm extremely interested in it, and I'm extremely saddened that some of the details that we've heard today.
The general theme that's coming through, Lindsay, is about support in the community. And if you look at the comparison, say, with America, where, you know, it's fairly standard and almost non-stigmatized to say, I'm going for therapy today. You know, if you don't get the job you're after, you go for therapy. And I'm not trivialising this. There's a different culture. But I certainly have been aware that particularly in the third sector, a lot of work's going into people studying, for example, diploma in counselling and so on, which is a long, hard struggle. I've got a few friends doing that currently. But it's also about making sure that counselling is available for people, obviously through statutory services, but also in voluntary services as well. I mean, would that link in with your view, looking at the petition, that should be a lot more support, a lot more counselling available, in the communities for those suffering from mental illness?
Yeah, that would be my view. If you can avoid hospital, in my opinion, that is the best way to go.
Right. Thank you for that. I think Anne McTaggart's helpfully suggested a way forward, which is that we would continue the petition to call on Scottish Government and others for their views on the petition, and the clerk's laid out a number of different groups that we should be writing to. Can I ask my colleagues their views on that? Are people and all committee members agreeable that we should continue this?
Just on that, on the basis that the Health and Sport Committee had looked at this issue, not just solely in 2009, I just wonder whether or not it might be better in the first stage to refer it to them, so that they can build on the evidence that they had before.
John Wilson?
While I respect what Chip Brodie suggested, could I suggest that we have a first trawl at this issue, and they will write to a number of organisations seeking their views before we pass it on to the Health and Sport Committee, because I think there are some issues that we may be able to draw out, because there's a number of organisations. I know the clerks have helpfully provided a list of organisations they suggest we should write to in this petition, but I've also noted down a couple of other organisations, and I would list through the organisations the clerks have suggested: Scottish Government, Scottish Association for Mental Health, Scottish Recovery Network, Royal College of Psychiatrists, Penundra, and a selection of NHS boards. Could I also suggest we write to Renfrewshire Association for Mental Health and Glasgow Association for Mental Health, as well as the BMA? Because I think the issue about referral on from GPs, and Lindsay gave a startling response in terms of GPs at a local surgery level aren't always aware of what they're looking for, and it might be worthwhile writing to the BMA to ask them what their general guidelines are to general practitioners in relation to the dealing with patients who present with what may be seen as a mental health illness, whatever that mental health illness may be.
So I think generally what we're asking the various organisations is what's their view on the petition. Is there any other questions members wish to have answered by these various committees? Anne McTaggart?
Thanks, Convener. John Wilson mentioned earlier about the education aspect of it. Would it be possible then to hear their views from it as well? Through the Curriculum for Excellence and
I think it might also be useful to write to STVO, and taking up my point on the important role that the third sector plays. We're writing to one organisation, but they're obviously the umbrella body for the sector. I think it's useful to get their views. Are members happy with that course of action? And could I finally, Lindsay, thank you very much for your presentation. I think all the committee members really enjoyed your comments. I think you've really raised our awareness about this issue. As you hear, we're continuing a petition to call on key organisations to get their view on your petition, and the clerks will make sure that you're kept up to date with all the stages of development. So thank you very much again for coming along. I know it's a daunting task, and I just suspend the meeting for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to change round. Thank you again. start our committee. The second new petition is PE 1439 by Jonathan McCall on betting and loan shops in deprived communities. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. Could I welcome our witnesses today? Councillor Jonathan McCall from Western Berkshire Council and Myrna Cameron from the Chairman of Block and Haldane Community Council. You're very welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along. I think Gil Patterson was also interested in attending, but I don't think we got him so far. Could I invite Councillor McCall to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes, then I'll kick off with a question and my colleagues will follow up. Councillor McCall.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just before I begin, first of all, Gil Patterson was hoping to come along, but I understand there's another committee meeting at the same time which is discussing the budget, so if it finishes early, he may appear. I also want to make clear before I begin, I'm not here representing Western Berkshire Council, although I am a member of Western Berkshire Council. It was a petition that I submitted on my own, so just to make that perfectly clear. So, Mr Chairman, elected members, thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity to raise this issue at Parliamentary Committee. I'd also like to record my thanks to your clerking team, and in particular Mr Chris Hind, who's been extremely helpful and has kept me informed at every stage. As per the guidance I've received, I'll try not to stray into commentary on details already before you in writing. I've raised this issue because I believe that we need to stop the proliferation of betting and high-interest loan shops in deprived communities across Scotland. As you already know, I've got support from individuals and groups from the rest of the UK. That's in your briefing, and I have support me here today, Mr Murdo Cameron from Balloch Community Council. He is also the convener of Western Berkshire Community Councils Forum, which represents all the community councils in the area. It's my firm belief that betting and high-interest loan shops are targeting deprived areas, taking advantage of low rents caused by the current economic situation and saturating our town centres. It's important to note that I'm not asking this committee to seek a change in legislation at this time. I understand how the system works, and if we're to come up with a fit-for-purpose solution, we will need robust evidence of a link between the number of these premises and levels of deprivation, along with evidence of a link between fixed odds betting terminals, which we'll speak about more, and problem gambling, coupled with statistical evidence for individual communities. Research done in England and Wales by GeoFutures and the National Centre for Social Research on behalf of Channel 4 Dispatches shows that in affluent areas with low unemployment, there are only 5 betting offices per 100,000 population. Contrast that with 12 per 100,000 population in areas of high unemployment. But the real issue, as I've alluded to, is the relationship between so-called fixed odds betting terminals and problem gambling, which has an adverse effect on whole families, communities and the wider local economy. In Dumbarton, as well as other operators, there are 2 bookmakers from the same company, a stone's throw from each other. As I understand it, this is because legislation means they're only permitted to have 4 of these fixed odds betting terminals in any one shop. Therefore, they open 2 shops in order to double their income. Gambling Commission stats from April 2008 to March 2011 calculate that in the UK, around £1.2 billion was lost by people on these machines alone, on which it's possible to gamble £18,000 every hour on a single machine because of the way the timing is set up on them. Further research by Professor Jim Orford of Birmingham University has estimated that in the same period, people with a gambling addiction in the UK lost around £57 million on horse racing, £75 million betting on dog racing, £75 million in casinos, but a staggering £297 million on fixed odds betting machines. And this is where the problem is, in my opinion. I have to say, as a councillor, it's been extremely frustrating over the past 5 years, with planning committees refusing permission for these premises, only to have that quashed on appeal. I feel we need the powers to help our communities improve and flourish. I'm not anti-gambling, but if we are concerned and can regulate the number of alcohol licensed premises with an over-provision policy in order to help protect those with an alcohol addiction with the right evidential and statistical basis, I don't see why we couldn't regulate gambling in the same way. I'm also not anti-payday loan. I think the interest charges are ridiculous, and there are serious concerns about how these operations treat people who have trouble paying their loans back on time. But I also know that, used responsibly and carefully, These places do provide a service to people in an emergency situation, albeit I do advise my own constituents to join a local credit union as a better alternative. Bookmakers will tell you that there are procedures in place to protect people with problems, and that in extreme cases they can intervene and stop people playing the machines, but with the best will in the world there is absolutely nothing they can do if the customer, caught in a downward spiral of addiction, simply moves to one of the many other local betting premises on the same street that haven't seen him in a while. I'm fortunate that I've never had an addiction, and as such I cannot possibly fully understand what sufferers go through. But what I do know is that people with an addiction, such as problem gambling, think differently. They don't reason in the same way that the rest of us do, and running out of cash is often not enough to stop them, and this is where the payday loan shops come in. What's to stop people from popping next door to the payday loan shop, getting £200, which is a normal poor credit limit, and then losing it in less than a minute on one of these machines? Interest charges and late payment fees aside, you might not think it a serious issue to be losing an extra £200, but what if there are 3 or 4 payday loan shops in the one area, with fixed odds bet machines eating up to £300 a minute? That's a potential £800 lost in less than 3 minutes, with an average of £25 interest for every £100 borrowed from these lenders. You're talking about someone increasing potentially their debt by £1,000, or more, depending on the number of payday loan shops in the local area. This is a serious issue, and I strongly believe that the Scottish Government needs to take a serious look at it. And the last thing I'll say is I had a quick look at your SPICE briefing that the Clarking team had prepared, and it notes that obviously gambling is a reserved matter. I'm aware of that, and that's why I'm not seeking anything on the gambling legislation. I think this can be dealt with by the Scottish Parliament through an over-provision policy with planning. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor McCall. It was very helpful. And just to say to Mr Cameron, if you want to come in at any stage, just please indicate, and be very happy to take any questions or points that you have.
Yes, Convener.
Sorry, it wasn't an invite to give another 5-minute speech, but very free to come in at any other time later on in this event. Could I just say this at the start, Councillor McCall, do you feel that the current planning provisions do give any controls, or are you looking for more powers on planning? Because I understand from the Scottish Government that there is Article 4 directions that gives power to local authorities to control certain issues such as betting shops by removing permitted development rights. So the UK Government line is there actually is power and control there. But are you saying, yes, it's there, but it's not being used well enough? Or are you saying that your petition would really want more powers for planning to give you more clout over the issues that you're raising in your petition?
In practice, Mr Chairman, it doesn't work. What our own planning officers tell us is that there are no grounds on which we can refuse, and when you do refuse permission, it is overturned on appeal to the Scottish Government because there are no robust grounds on which to refuse. And what I'm seeking is a similar situation to what they have with alcohol licensing, whereby if you've got the proper statistical evidence, you can refuse on the grounds of over-provision, because the current legislation doesn't give us enough flexibility.
So that's obviously subject to appeal as well, now, if I recall from my past days in licensing board. Right, thank you very much for that. Can I start with Chick Brodie?
Good morning. I wonder, Mr McCall, if you can give some indication in terms of the profile now of betting, because a lot of betting is now done on the internet. I mean, how do we achieve what your petition seeks to achieve if that movement seems to be accelerating? Is that not the case? I mean, how would you address that?
I absolutely agree with you, Mr Brodie. Online gambling is increasing, but unfortunately gambling is a reserved matter, so there isn't anything that the Scottish Parliament can do. What I've got to look at here in coming to yourselves is I've got to work within the constraints of the powers that the Scottish Parliament have, and I do feel that changes to the planning legislation could make a significant difference to people's lives in our communities. Many of the people that we're talking about here that have these problems don't have internet access, for example, so it's not as easy for them to access that type of gambling. I know it's only a small thing that I'm suggesting for, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Just I mean, just on the payday loan thing, which is, after hearing the R3 customer survey this morning, is a major blight on what's happening economically. Do you think there should be more control in terms of linking and registering companies, payday loan shops, as they have in Australia and now have in some of the states in America, where they all have to register, and there is a database where people are checked how much they're actually being loaned? Is that something that you think might be feasible?
Well, I wasn't actually aware of that. It certainly sounds like a very sensible approach that's been taken elsewhere, and I'm sure it is something that the Parliament and the Government will be looking at. It really is a very, very serious problem. But as I say, I'm sort of, with this petition, I'm sticking strictly to the issue of problem gambling and the links between access to these sort of payday loan shops and their proximity to many gambling premises.
I want to check a company called Veritech, who have issued the software in Australia and the States.
Thank you.
Other members wish to come in? Amit Taggart.
Convener, and welcome to Scottish Parliament, and thank you very much for your petition. We had a debate quite recently within the Chamber. I'm sure it was by John Mason, that we looked at exactly what you've described here in your petition. I think it's important that we do refer back to the Scottish Government and also the UK Government to look at them, to ask them to look at their planning laws to try and eradicate, because I mean I think we're finding it more and more frequent that in areas, well most certainly areas of Glasgow as well, that there's a betting shop next to the payday loan shop, and you know there's loads of them even in such a small confined area, and it's quite frightening. But also we have, both myself and John Wilson are on the credit union cross-party group, but we have in the past asked for investment in credit unions to try and assist communities to go down another route as opposed to tackling the payday loan sharks. And
views on that?
Absolutely, I would wholeheartedly agree. And you know, contacting the UK Government is a positive step as well as is in the paperwork in front of you. This was actually born out of discussions that I had online with Councillor Rowena Davis, who represents the constituency of Peckham in London, and also she got involved with a group called Gambling Reform and Society Perception, which is a group that deals with problem gambling issues, lobbying, such like. So yeah.
Thank you. Could I perhaps bring Mr Cameron in now? Mr Cameron, what's your views on the petition?
Well, Convener, very briefly, I obviously concur with Councillor McCall. I represent 10 community councils, and we have discussed this, and there's no doubt about it, these premises cause great misery to members of the community. First of all, the FOB machines, or terminals as they're called, according to the police, they're one of the main reasons for violence in these sort of premises. And if I may say that I know the high streets are going through difficult times, the businesses are failing, etc., etc. But every time there seems to be a vacancy in a premises, it's filled by one of those sort of businesses, which unfortunately inflicts more misery to the people. Now, I happen to know from personal reasons, which I won't obviously go into in detail, that these loan shark shops are really a terrible thing. Before you know where you are, you're hundreds and hundreds of pounds in debt. And it is a very difficult thing to address, how you could control it. And this is where I think Mr Brodie's suggestion, and maybe one way. Gambling, as we all know, because you're all experienced people, has been with us since time immemorial, since the Egyptians right through the road, etc., etc. It's nothing new, but it's on the increase, it's on our television, it's on the internet, it's everywhere. And more people are being dragged into this, and it really means misery and debt for many, many people.
I think Councillor McCall made a good point about, there is some planning controls, but if the council rules against it and then it goes to appeal, then the council are impotent in that. But the analogy from licensing is if there's an element about over-provision, going into that. Would you feel that would be quite useful? That would obviously be something the UK government would have to.
Yes, yeah. If we go back to the times when we had the shipyards and the steel works and the workers flowed out and went into the pub, etc., etc., to a certain extent, we still have too many pubs. We have licensed shops at nearly every corner. There ought to be more control to sort of get rid of some of these and put a sort of control on some of the licenses that we do provide these premises with.
I think the petition is very clear what it's calling from to the Scottish Government, and I understand that the Scottish Government's currently consulting on the National Planning Framework 3 anyway, so this is perhaps a good time for us to refer this petition to them to get their views. So that would be, I think, a very sensible way forward. Do other members who have not been in wish to contribute? Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I've certainly got a lot of sympathy for this petition, and I can relate to the points raised as a former local councillor. I was particularly interested to hear how betting shops can get round the fixed odds betting machines limits by opening another shop next door, which is a concern and one I hadn't picked up on in the past. Also, as a former councillor, I'm aware of the frustrations with regard to planning applications being refused by the planning committee and then being approved on appeal, particularly in cases where you have payday loan shops and betting shops. Another issue which has concerned me for some time, and Chick Brodie touched on, is the proliferation of online casino adverts on TV, which is another issue that maybe for discussion on another day. But it's clearly having an impact on families in deprived communities. I know that the Economy and Energy Minister, Fergus Ewing, has made representation to the UK Government. He actually mentioned that in the Chamber in response to a question some time ago on payday loan companies. So I know that the Government have been certainly aware of the issue. But it may be worth asking the Local Government Minister, Convener, in addition to the Scottish Government, to specifically respond to the petition, given that it is such an issue.
Most definitely. Does any other member wish to come in? Do other witnesses wish to add anything in addition?
No, I would really just like to thank the committee for taking on board my concerns and trying to find a way forward with it.
Sure. Well, if you could just stay with us for a few seconds, because we're looking at the next stage. But certainly my view is that we should certainly continue this petition. I think there's a lot of merit in it, particularly at a time when the Scottish Government is already consulting on planning, as I said, on the National Planning Framework. The clerk's laid out a series of action points in action point 1. I would certainly suggest we go down that road. That includes the Gambling Commission, the Office of Fair Trading and the Association of British Bookmakers, which would ask these various bodies what their views are on the petition. Are members agreeable to that way forward?
Yep.
John Wilson?
On board Anne McTaggart's point about right to the UK Government about this petition as well, just so that we get a view from the UK Government, because clearly the issues about Gambling Act and the payday loan companies, and like Mr Cameron's description of the loan shark shops in their high street, if only they were classified as loan sharks, we wouldn't have as many of them in the high streets, but the rates are clearly charging a lot higher than loan sharks. But if we could write to the UK Government, because it is their legislation in the main they were actually dealing with in terms of the Gambling Act and the Financial Services Authority as well.
Go. Check, Brodie.
Just very quickly, I don't know if you've checked, Mr McCall, but I certainly haven't. But do you think the ownership of the bookmakers and the payday loans might be the same, one and the same, in some cases?
I have absolutely no idea, and when it's a verbatim minute, I wouldn't like to speculate. But it's certainly worth checking, yes.
Jackson Carroll?
Can I also agree with you, Convener? Can I, just to prove I'm not curmudgeonly about all the time, say that I actually thought that was one of the best, most focused presentations I've heard so far on the Petitions Committee, with a very measured and sensible approach, and I'm very happy to take forward the recommendation that my silence, reticence to enter into questions should not be taken as having been disinterested or unimpressed.
Could I say that praise from Jackson Carlisle is praise indeed? So thank you very much for coming along. And thank you again for your evidence. I think all the committees enjoyed it. It's a very good petition. And I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you both again, gentlemen.
Thank you.
If we can move on to agenda item 3, consideration of. Can we move to agenda item 3, consideration of current petitions. It's PE 1402 by Richard Jones on behalf of Addressing the Balance on a Strategy and Policy for Diagnosing and Treating Adult ADHD in Scotland. Members, a note by the Clerk. There certainly is a recommendation that as the Scottish Government's mental health strategy has now been published and a commitment has been given to develop appropriate specialist capability which meets the terms of the petition, that we're in a good position to close the petition. Are members agreeable?
Agreed.
Nice. Thank you. If I can then move to the second current petition, is PE 1412 by Bill McDowell on bodification. Members, a note by the Clerk, it's paper 6, and submissions, and members may wish to have some comments on this. But I think certainly there's a strong argument that we continue this petition until the Scottish Government's consultation on succession laws is complete. John Wilson.
The petitioner, and if it's right, better double check this, convener, because I got caught out at the last meeting. It was in terms of petition 1412. The petitioner has suggested that we actually possibly refer this on to the Justice Committee. I don't know whether that would be appropriate at this time to do that, but it's just that if the petitioner's made that request, it may be that if the petitioner thinks that would be the best course of action at this time, that we could pass it on to Justice.
I'm perfectly relaxed, Mr. Wilson, to refer it on to Justice. Obviously, I don't have an up-to-date concept of their work programme. I know that it's a very busy committee, but nevertheless, it's perfectly competent to do that. And if members wish to do that, I'm certainly agreeable.
Consultation before taking that decision, just on this occasion.
Can I take other members' views?
Both arguments. Yeah, I suppose it would be fair to wait until the publication of the Scottish Government's consultation. Yeah.
Certainly wouldn't rule out us referring it at that stage, but it just gives us a bit more intel. Mr. Wilson, would you be?
Accept Mr. Carlow's desire to keep this petition open.
Physician heal thyself, I think.
You can dine out.
So I think it's agreeable that we keep this open until the Scottish Government's consultation on the succession laws are clear. And if I can move to the third current petition, it's PE 1415 by John Steele on updating the Burial Ground Scotland Act 1855. Members, a note by the Clerk. I think certainly having a look through this in detail, and remember obviously the evidence from last time, I think actually there's quite a strong argument for closing this particular petition in that the Scottish Government have followed through on the issues raised by the petition, and I think the excavation of Ardrossan Cemetery has also taken place, which was the other issue. So certainly in my mind it looks there's a strong argument here for closing, but obviously I'm open to views from members. Is that all agreed? John Wilson?
The only comment I would make is I like the last paragraph from the in terms of the government response, that they're already indicating what the decision may be, and it's quite helpful recommendation, I think, in terms of the Scottish Government. But I think it might be worthwhile reminding the Scottish Government, if they've read this official record, it's this committee that makes the decision whether or not to close or refer on petitions, not civil servants in the Scottish Government.
Well, John Wilson's exactly right. Irrespective of what decision we take, it's our decision and no one else. So, but nevertheless, we're still closing it. If we're moving to the fourth current petition, it's PE 1425 by Maureen Harkness on the adverse impacts of DVLA local office closures. Members have a note by the Clerk and submissions. And there was a late submission from the petitioner which was circulated on Friday. Can invite contributions from members. I think there is one possible referral to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, but nevertheless, I'll leave it to members to make a decision. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. I have no comment to make on this at the present time.
Right. Are members happy with referring it to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee? Okay, so it's agreed to refer the petition under Rule 15.6.2 to the Infrastructure.
In so doing, that I note that following the request, I think, of Mr Wilson to consult the Scottish Motor Trade Association, they rather supported my view that they didn't think there was anything to be lost by the closure of DVLAs, but they have concerns about the effective provision of service after that, but not necessarily through that mechanism.
Clarify, the Scottish Motor Trade Association's concerns were raised about the cost of the delivery of the new services, and I'm sure Mr Carlaw, in his capacity in wearing another hat, would be quite concerned about the changes to the delivery of provision of services. Actually, would, in the views of the Scottish Motor Trade Association, could actually potentially cost us more money rather than be cost-saving.
Our colleagues' Infrastructure Capital Investment Committee will look very carefully at our comments. Can we move then to the fifth current petition? It's PE 1426 by Donna Scott on the National Donor Milk Banks service. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. Invite contributions from members, and I think again there's quite a strong argument for continuing this particular course of action till spring. Members agreeable with that course of action? Thank you. The sixth and final current petition is PE 1428 by Councillor Douglas Felland on behalf of First on improvements for the 83. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. Members will know that I've got a regional interest in this issue, and I felt very strongly that it's a very strong petition. Just picking up on some of the comments in it, I would certainly suggest that irrespective of course of action, that there's an argument for asking Galway Butte Council where they've asked for the trunking of the road to Campbelltown, because that was in the report by the Transport Minister. My assumption was that that had already happened, but if it's not happened, the route to this is the relevant local authority requesting the Scottish Government to trunk that section of the road. So I would certainly suggest that we do check this particular issue out. And I also thought there was a strong point by the councillor about inserting a ro-ro ferry from Campbelltown to the Ayrshire coast, using some aspects of the spare, if there is indeed any spare vessels in the Calmac fleet. That certainly echoes my own experience visiting Campbelltown recently, where there's a strong demand, I think, in the local area for ferry services. There's a real sense that Campbelltown is a bit cut off both by the problems of the road and not having an adequate ferry, particularly for freight. I think it was very strong.
There is an ongoing, as you know, convener, ongoing discussion between the ferry between Campbelltown and Troon.
Yes.
The question is volumes and financial stability.
So my recommendation is we certainly continue this petition to chase up these points and the points raised in 15.1 in our paper. Any member wish to contribute?
Sorry, just in terms of the third point made by the petitioner in the response to the answers we've had so far, is the economic impact situation in terms of the road closure. There was a wider discussion when we heard oral evidence about the economic impact for the region in relation to the roads transport network in that area. And one of the things that we had suggested is writing to local authorities in the area to ask them if they had done any assessment of the economic impact that may be achieved by increasing the road network. But clearly, given the petitioners raised it in terms of the economic impact of the road clossures, it might be worthwhile writing to the petitioner to say if he's had any joy in asking the local authorities or Highlands and Islands Enterprise if they've had a view on the economic impact there would be to the area if the roads were improved.
Certainly think, High would certainly have an interest in this issue. I don't know whether they've actually made this assessment. I'm certainly meeting their new chair in a few weeks' time, but I think we, independently of that, should perhaps contact High as well about that point. Any other member wish to add any additional points? Are members happy with that course of action? Well, could I thank you very much for this very busy session I think we've had today, and I formally close the meeting. Thank you.